last session of the day. This one, we're going to cite Julia in the world of television. Just a little logistical note on your programs. I think it has Morash going first, but in fact, we're going to switch the order. So Dana Polan will be speaking first. A couple of nights ago, I was in New York, and I was having dinner at Blue Hole Restaurant. And afterwards, I was talking to the chef, Dan Barber, and in the course of the conversation, I mentioned that I was coming up here to participate in this symposium. And he said, "Oh, I just heard the best story about Julia from my lamb guy." And in chef speak, the lamb guy would be the farmer who raises the lambs that are served at the restaurant. In any case, I guess this lamb guy had a reputation for raising really superior lamb, and somehow Julia had found out about him and wanted to meet him. So she invited this farmer to breakfast at her house one morning, and he showed up at 9 o'clock, and she was about to pour him a cup of coffee when she looked over on the counter and she saw an open bottle of wine that was left over from a dinner party the night before. So she looks at the bottle, and she looks at him, and she said, "That's a really good Barolo." And we can't let it go to waste. And so at that breakfast, they had a very good, only slightly oxidated Barolo. Now, I've never met Julia Child. I've had a couple of close encounters, but I never actually met her. So if that story rings true to me and to all of you here, or to many of you here, it is because I have the sense of knowing her through television. I can, as we all can, I think, call up that voice, call up that bearing, call up her bemused yet unruffled response to a collapsed apple charlotte or a very slippery roast chicken. And yes, we know about her appreciation for a good glass of wine. And we learned all of these things, again, through the medium of television. But it wasn't just that we sort of learned these things about her. We also, I think, absorbed her message. And that message was not just about how to cook, although that was, of course, a very important part of it. It was also that cooking, and that indeed, I think, food itself can be a form of creativity, and that it can be a form of entertainment. And if we consider today our kind of hothouse food culture, with its, Rachel Ray's and its Top Chefs and its food porn websites and glossy magazines, and all of those aficionados who spend their weekends and their vacations chasing down the next Michelin chef or tracking the best soup dumplings in Queens. Some of that, I think, that idea comes back to the idea that food is entertainment, and that is an idea that, at least in part, we can thank Julia for. At least the televised Julia. Now, Dana's going first, right? Dana is going to be talking about how Julia changed the genre of the cooking show, how she brought new meaning and value to it. He is a professor of cinema and media studies at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. He is also on the board of Gastronomica magazine, and he's won great recognition for his work, including being knighted by the French Ministry of Culture for contributions to cross-cultural exchange. Professor Polan has written extensively on many aspects of film, publishing 8 books that range from a history of early film studies in the US to an analysis of Quentin Tarantino's modern classic, Pulp Fiction. But if you think that's cool, you should also look at what he does on television, because he's written 2 monographs about what are my 2 favorite television shows, one, The Sopranos, and the other, The French Chef. Our other panelist is perhaps the person most responsible for giving us that sense of knowing Julia. Russ Morash joined WGBH, the local public television station here, in 1957. And later in his career would go on to produce and direct several shows you may have heard of, such as The Victory Garden, This Old House, and New Yankee Workshop. All told, in the course of his career, he has won 14 national Emmy Awards. But what he's going to be talking about today came before all of that. In 1963, when he was teamed up with a budding cookbook author that no one had ever heard of to produce a cooking show. And we all know what the result of that was. The French Chef was produced for a remarkable 10 years and then ran regularly in reruns until 1989. And in fact, you can still see it sometimes on the Cooking Channel now. It also won both a Peabody and an Emmy. Together, Child and Morash would go on to make other shows and would, in fact, in the end, work together for 30 years. So first, we'll have Dana up.
I should say that the reason we decided to switch the order is that Russ is going to talk a lot about the French Chef from its beginnings and on, and then later shows. And one of the things I want to talk about is what in my book on Julia Child I call cooking shows BC, before Child. So I'm going to be talking about, in a sense, the prehistory of the cooking show, because I think it really takes off with the French Chef. But there are shows before, and that's some of what I want to talk about and demarcate her show from previous efforts. And I want to start by thanking Elizabeth Cohen from the Radcliffe Institute and Nancy Cott as director of the Schlesinger Library. And I guess here I also want to thank the Schlesinger Library itself. I did a lot of the research for the Julia Child book in the archives. Originally I was going to say buried in the archives, but you don't feel buried in these archives. It's a beautiful site. It's sunny. Documents are brought to you, and it's a wonderful place to work. And I'll be mentioning some of the findings I came across in the archive in a little bit. But it was great to work in the Schlesinger Library on Julia Child's papers and some of the other people who had cooking shows, for example, Dione Lucas. I'll come back to that. I also wanted, because this is a public occasion, I wanted to acknowledge and thank Russ Morash. Russ was very helpful to me by email and phone call. I hadn't met him till today. He gave me so much information on the day-to-day production of the French Chef and helped me understand what day-to-day production is like on a cooking show like the French Chef. Except he also helped me understand that there was no cooking show like the French Chef. And that's what I want to talk about today, both in what ways the French Chef comes out of earlier shows, but also diverges from them. In a sense, one of the things I argue in my study of Julia Child is that she's a kind of figure of transition or mediation or in-betweenness, or since we're in a scholarly context, she's a liminal figure, a figure of liminality, so she's between different identities. She, for example, is between different notions of gender identity. She's examining, in a sense, what's proper, but also what's improper for a strong, strapping woman in the kitchen. She's in between notions of television as pedagogy and television as entertainment, and I'll come back to that. She's, as we heard earlier today, a mediator or in between France and America. She's a cultural translator. And what I especially want to talk about today is the way in which she's in between older conceptions of hosted instructional TV, very prevalent in the 1950s, and newer goals of television starting in the 1960s on as both entertainment and instruction. And I think Laura earlier today referred to Julia Studies. Anyone who's in this area called Julia Studies, when you give a paper or presentation, one question that comes up is, would she survive on the Food Network today? Isn't she so different? She is different, but she's also creating a legacy. For example, and I'll come back to this, I don't think Graham Kerr is able to be a galloping gourmet until Julia Child moves around the kitchen the way she does. And I'll come back to that. She sets up possibilities for later cooking shows, even if at times they seem to be too much infotainment or entertainment and not enough information. To give you an example of one of the ways her legacy was recognized recently, legacy for these later shows, I'll simply quote, and I'm not saying I completely agree with this, but it's a good quote. In the New York Times a couple weeks ago, in the business section, there was an article about Marcus Samuelsson as a brand, and I was struck by the following sentences. Mr. Samuelsson is the figurative heir of Julia Child and Wolfgang Puck, and you could already ask, how did those two get together? So he's the figurative heir of Julia Child and Wolfgang Puck, but he's hardly the only one. Mario Batali, Todd English, who was mentioned before, Tom Colicchio, Alain Ducasse, Bobby Flay, Lydia Bastianich, David Burke. The list of marquee names in celebrity chefdom is long. Many of the chefs have built sprawling empires with restaurants, not the case in Julia Child. And they have captured the popular imagination with TV shows, iPhone apps, and assorted products, unquote. So what I want to do today is talk about the French chef in relation to the genre of the cooking show. And in the book, some of the questions I raise are, what was the cooking show like before she comes on the scene? What differences did she bring to the form? What differences did that mean for TV as a medium? What did it especially mean for the ways in which television is often caught between a mission of instruction and a mission of entertainment? Now, when I started the project, working on Julia Child, and I would mention it to people, they would say two things generally. They'd say, what a great project. And then they'd say, and she had the very first cooking show, didn't she? And as a historian of culture, when anybody says something about the first, I always want to go out and find out, is that true? And I generally assume there was something before. There's very few cases of absolute firstness. So I started doing research on cooking shows from the moment of the post-war period. And in fact, there are cooking shows before the post-war period. And what you discover when you start researching, especially if you have a good coterie of people to help you, is that there were dozens of cooking shows. Through the 1950s, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of shows. And I would argue they're not incidental or sporadic. They're certainly not incidental to early television, but in many ways formative of early television. Early television, especially early daytime TV, depends on the cooking show. It's almost integral to what daytime TV is in the 1940s and 50s. To take one example, during the Second World War, a lot of investigation or a lot of experiment in commercial television is interrupted. Effort needs to be placed elsewhere. A lot of the technology is being used for the military. But one place where you have television is in VA hospitals, especially for veterans, where it's assumed that once the war ends, they will go back into the workforce in one way or another. And so television is piped into VA hospitals, and one of the most common shows is cooking shows. The idea is they're going to train. So someone earlier mentioned GIs on the GI Bill in the post-war period, but it's already happening during the Second World War that one of the jobs you can take in the post-war world is as a cook. If any of you know the 50s film It's Always Fair Weather with Gene Kelly, Michael Kidd in that film plays a GI who wants to open an elegant French restaurant. And it's interesting how it's become so much part of the popular imagination that it can be in a Hollywood film. There are dozens of such shows, and especially through the 50s when, and this is something a friend of mine Lynn Spiegel, who's probably our best media scholar, talks about, it's not clear whether TV's greatest vocation is to be a daytime medium or an evening medium. And a lot of people are thinking about it as primarily daytime, with the assumption, maybe stereotypical, that daytime TV is going to be primarily women's TV. And cooking shows are popular on daytime TV because they're cheap to make, and they fulfill an implicit mission of daytimeness. That is, they're going to entertain but not waste your time because they're also giving you something meaningful. Just to give you one statistic, in 1952, a MA student at Iowa State does her MA thesis on the cooking show on TV, a woman named Margaret McKeegan. So this is 1952, pretty early on. She writes to all the channels on the air at that point. There's 108 channels. 82 respond. 72 of them say they have a cooking show. Something like 60 of those say they have a permanent set, a cooking set. So it's a large percentage of the shows. Interestingly, and I'll come back to this, only a fourth of the stations that respond say they have a dining room connected to the set. And I want to come back to that. So it's primarily daytime TV that offers an instruction into modern everyday living. How to watch TV, how to listen, how to multitask. Soap operas are condemned on the one hand, but they're also welcomed because soap operas teach you how to do other things while watching TV. And in the 50s, if you watch soap operas, there's a lot of dialogue repetition. The assumption is you're going to go out of the room, do something else, come back in, and Brad is still breaking up with Susan. And it's a training in how to multitask, how to do other things. And one of the reasons why soap operas are so talky is you might not be in front of the screen at the moment. So there's a need for a kind of verbal redundancy. Let me get at this by showing you two clips. And first, just to show you Julia. So can we have the first clip?
Under this silver drum is Miss Charlotte Malakoff, who, with the support of Lady Fingers, is about to take part in an intriguing dessert drama today on The French Chef. Welcome to The French Chef. I'm Julia Child. Today we're going to do a really exquisite French dessert called Charlotte Malakoff. It's a chocolate almond cream molded in lady fingers. Malakoff is certainly an interesting name, but lady fingers, no. Perhaps if you called it La Fingère with a French accent, they would sound better, but I think the reason lady fingers make people sort of droop is because we're used to this loathsome, horrid, limp, soggy thing that's called a lady finger, and they're just absolutely disgusting. And if you use them in any decent dessert, it just wouldn't go. But if you make homemade lady fingers like this, which are nice little dry cookies made out of sponge cake batter, I think you will find that lady fingers would mean a delight to you. And all that these lady fingers are egg yolks, sugar, flour, and beaten egg whites. By themselves, they're not very interesting, but when they're dipped in liqueur and surround a lovely dessert like our Charlotte, they really come into their own.
Okay,
so
let's
we're
stop
going to
there.
make lady fingers.
I'm sorry. I always tell my students when you're giving a talk and showing visual material, when you interrupt it, it's always going to be a problem because people want to see more of the clip. But I want to go on, and just to show you how important Julia Child's personality is to her show, I want to read you, and then I want to talk about other shows. I want to read you Mastering the Art of French Cooking's version of what she just said, which is don't use store-bought lady fingers. And one of the things I say is, if the book is great, but you wouldn't read Mastering the Art of French Cooking and imagine a 6'2" sort of woman with that voice. It's a personable book. It reaches out to you, but you can't imagine her personality. Here's the equivalent. Warning, in italics, warning. Do not attempt any dessert calling for a mold lined with lady fingers, unless you have lady fingers of premium quality, dry and tender, not spongy and limp. Inferior lady fingers, unfortunately, the only kind usually available in bakeries, will debase an otherwise remarkable dessert. So, getting the same point across, but with a very different notion of personality. And that's what I want to talk about today, the role that personality has to play in Julia Child's entrance onto the scene of the television cooking show. Now, with exceptions, and I really want to emphasize that there are exceptions, and I'll come back to them. With exceptions, cooking shows until The French Chef tend to fall into a certain common pattern, again, with exceptions. They are often, generally, or they're not often, they're generally about how to do common American cooking and to do it quickly, healthfully, economically. And some of the assumption is what women in the post-war period need is not instruction in the exotic in French cooking. They need instruction in a cooking they should already know, but because they're marrying younger, moving away, now need to know. Ann Mendelsohn, who wrote a book on the joy of cooking, at one point mentions that if you look at turn of the 19th century cookbooks, they don't have a recipe for bread because it's assumed that any woman growing up will learn how to make bread. By 1950, you need to spell it out, and you need to spell it out in detail. It's no longer part of a common heritage. Now, one of the exceptions is, so if it's to do common cooking, American cooking, quickly, healthfully, economically, one exception is sometimes it should be aesthetic, and one time it should be aesthetic or more pleasing is, and this is a very common 1950s trope, when there's a last-minute or unexpected guest. And this shows up constantly. If you look at the I Hate to Cook cookbook by Peg Bracken, if you look at Sex and the Single Girl, a lot of which is actually a cookbook. If you look at Saucepans and the Single Girl, it's all about someone's coming over at the last minute. And you need then to impress them in part because it's usually your husband's boss. and he won't get a raise unless you cook an aesthetically pleasing meal. You know, if you watch Bewitched, Darren is endlessly bringing Larry home, and then Samantha has to decide, should I use magic or not? You know, can I use subterfuge to make my dinner pleasing? And you know, the idea that you would lose your job or lose a raise if your wife doesn't cook the right meal for the boss seems strange, but the very recurrence of that trope suggests it really is tapping into real social anxieties about advancement, about job security in the 1950s. So that's one exception. The TV show in the 1950s, and again, I'm simplifying, it's a very minimal and sparse kind of generic form. One way I started thinking about the cooking show in the 1950s, especially when I started finding some examples, was I borrowed an idea from the film scholar David Bordwell. In the 1980s, some of you probably know Bordwell if you took a film class, you read film art. Bordwell in the 1980s taught a course at Wisconsin called Sparse Cinema. And what he's talking about is the films of people like Ozu, Tarkovsky, Bresson, films with very slow pacing, long takes, minimal acting, minimal action. Now, I wouldn't want to say that the cooking show is sparse because it has the same aesthetic pretensions, although one thing I did discover, and this was my great discovery in the Schlesinger Library, in the Julia Child papers, because she kept all her press clippings, there's a press clipping there's a review of the show from the Berkeley Barb, that very out there, wild newspaper, by Lenny Lipton. And again, if any of you are film people, Lipton wrote the classic independent filmmaking textbook in the 70s. He was a kind of avant-garde guru. He also, interestingly, wrote the lyrics for Puff the Magic Dragon. And unfortunately, the review is undated. It's probably around late 60s, early 70s. And he says, in part because he's a defender of the avant-garde, he says, I don't watch commercial television or popular television. We know it's all terrible. But just to confirm that it's all terrible, I spent a week watching TV, and it is all terrible except for the French chef. And the French chef proves Marshall McLuhan. And I think it's about duration, temporality, et cetera. But for the most part, cooking TV in the 1950s is what we might call sparse television or minimalist television. It's sparse, and it's sparse in several ways, at least three ways. First of all, it's sparse in content. And what I mean by that, it's again common American fare. There's a book that Laura actually discovered that was incredibly useful to me in 1955. A man named William Kaufman, who works in TV and publishes these best TV teleplays of the 1950s. He publishes a book called Cooking with the Experts. And it's a cookbook of television cooking recipes. And that was a great resource for me because he also gives the biography of all the cooks. And he covers the 48 states plus the protectorates of Alaska and Hawaii and gives recipes from chefs on channels in each of those states. So it's sparse in content. With exceptions, it's common American fare. It's how to do hot dogs, how to do bean casseroles, things like that. It's sparse in setting. You take someone, you plunk them down in a kitchen. In the mid-50s, a woman named Ellen Pinnell publishes a book called Women on TV, and it's a guidebook on how to develop a career in TV. And the biggest section is on cooking shows, the assumption being this is one place where women can be in front of the camera, and she says there are two basic kitchen sets. There's the L set, which is the angled corner, put someone in a corner, or there's the U, where you're in the center with two walls. And one of the things I'll come back to is Julia Child, when she has her set, makes her set both of those in a way. So it's sparse in content, common American fare, sparse in setting, someone behind a counter going through the motions, what we now call dump and stir TV. And it's especially sparse in structure and style. For the most part, it's chronological. It's even not merely chronological, but in real time. And there's lots of reasons for that. Some of it has to do with live TV in the 50s. Some of it has to do with what cooking is, which is a process that once you get it going, it's hard to interrupt it. You know, if you're boiling something, you can't say cut and then start again, or you have to go back to the beginning. And that's hard when you're filming live, and it's especially hard when you're broadcasting live. You can cheat, you can have, and you had this on your show, if you're doing a turkey dish, there might be turkeys at different stages. But you still have to generally adhere to chronology and real duration. It's sparse in visual style, for the most part, and I think Russ is also going to talk about it. For the most part, cooking television is two-camera TV. One, and there's lots of reasons for that, what's available to the studios at the time, but also it makes sense. One camera is on the whole body of the person. The other camera cuts into close-ups, and you saw that. Julia, in the first shot, is the hands working with the Charlotte Malakoff, camera pulls back, and then there are cuts back and forth between the hands and the full body. And that makes sense. You have a person instructing, you have hands doing. What's interesting is if you look at today's TV, recently I did a close analysis of an episode of Giada, Everyday Italian, and it absolutely adheres to the same model. When she's in the kitchen, long shot of the whole body, close-up of hands, the body, hands, body, hands. The episode I watched, it's about beach picnic. When she gets to the beach, suddenly people are playing volleyball, they're all over the place. It opens up. But in the kitchen, there's a functional reason to focus on the whole teacher, the teacher as a whole, and then the manual labor that the teacher is going through. It's also sparse stylistically in terms of the manner of delivery. Many chefs in the 1950s, it's very instructional, very dry. The background of many of the teachers is home economics, and they have a kind of matter-of-fact presentation. Now, there's exceptions. One exception is sometimes you get figures of uplift who want to use the cooking show for something more than common American fare. James Beard has one of the very first post-war cooking shows, 1946, 1947. The famous British chef who's trying to introduce French cuisine, Diony Lucas, has a show. Although if you watch Diony Lucas, it's French, it should be ooh la la, bon appetit, but it's an incredibly, incredibly dry show. There are several episodes in the Schlesinger Library. Importantly, and Kathleen Collins, who's one historian of the cooking show, just published an article on Diony Lucas, and she notes Lucas never tastes her food on the show. Not during the cooking, but also not at the end, because it's not about pleasure. It's about making this thing that you present to others. So it's the woman as a kind of martyr. Another exception, you're doing this for your family. You present the food outward. Another exception, the performing character. And in the 50s, there are examples of the chef who's doing shtick. Ernie Kovacs, for instance, the famous TV comic, has two cooking shows in the 1950s. And they're presented as a kind of gag thing where there's a professional chef, and Kovacs keeps trying to interrupt him, sort of like Jerry Lewis trying to interrupt Dean Martin as he's singing a song. So sketch cooking, or cooking with sketches. Let me just show you one example of 50s cooking. This is from the early 50s. This is Edith Green from San Francisco.
Kind of festive mood today, and well, we're sort of in the mood for having company. Because you know, I told you that today we were going to have a real company dinner. Partly something that I started yesterday, partly something that I started day before yesterday. Remember the avocado ring that I made Wednesday? Well, I've unmolded that, and I'm going to garnish it and add all kinds of good things to it for the starter for a company dinner. And then yesterday, I made the Creole cake. And today, of course, it's cold and ready to be frosted, and I'll fill and frost that. And then for our main course for company dinner, and this is really wonderful because, you know, so often you want to have something that's real special for guests, but you don't want to be in the kitchen at the last minute. So this is a chicken casserole. It's one that my family just loves, and that, of course, I do too. And it's something that you can prepare practically 90% in the morning. Practically everything can be done ahead, and you can even have your dishes washed up and your kitchen all clean and everything in the casserole just ready to put in the oven when your guests ring the front doorbell if necessary. So you start out, well, I'll tell you a little bit later what I started out with, but right now I'm going to season
you can cut there.
these quartered
You can
broilers.
stop there. Again, you saw the long shot and then the close-up as she salts the chicken. Now, another way to stand out from the anonymity of a lot of the shows is to have some kind of defining shtick. So, for example, Chef Milani, who has one of the very first shows, has mangled English. The Bon Tempis sing opera. There's a chef in Chicago who sings, who recites poetry. So something that makes you stand out. A trait, a shtick, an eccentricity, or some character, some defining character trait that distinguishes you. And I want to show you, for me, the most amazing example, and I've just been working on this figure. This is a Latina woman in San Francisco named Elena Zelaieta, and I want to show you about a minute of her show.
When Elena cooks, it's sure a treat. When Elena
everybody. Welcome to my kitchen. I'm going to make pickled tuna fish for you today. Is that you, Billy?
Yes, Mother.
Well, honey, how did the fishing come?
I'd rather not say.
Oh, really? Didn't you bring me one of those tuna fishes that we can use on with the recipe?
Just a second, I'll lay my rod down.
Oh, let's see, I'm so anxious.
Promise you won't tell anybody?
I promise, darling, but let's look. What have you? Oh, how wonderful. You mean, darling, do you think that this is all you got?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, no, darling, let me see. Oh, darling, that is. Oh, Billy. But I promise, darling, I won't tell a soul about it. Now, you go and put your whale away, and in the meantime, I'll start telling our viewers about the tuna fish. Now I will do
Can
the
you freeze
picking.
it for a second? Let me say a couple things about it. When I showed this once, Laura said, it'd be interesting to find out psychoanalytically what happened to Billy. What does it mean? What does it mean when your mother on TV talks about your small tuna? I actually interviewed Billy, who's now 77. I can talk about that later. The thing I wanted, I was talking about a defining trait. I don't know if any of you caught it, and I'm going to show maybe 10 seconds, 20 seconds more. Elena Zelayeto is totally blind. She had lost vision in the 1930s. She's doing this by the fact that she had been sighted. The rumor is that there are strings on her legs to tell her which camera to look at, but she's doing this blind. That's why you might see her sort of groping around. Can we see just a little bit more now, so you can see it now that you know she's blind?
For the pickled tuna. I have here a 4-ounce can in my refrigerator of mushrooms. I'm going to put that in here. Oh, my goodness gracious. Why don't
Okay,
I
let's
do
stop
it?
there. You can see that online. So I want to just bring this to Julia Child and very quickly argue that all the things I was saying are the norms of sparse television. It's not so much that Julia Child overthrows them or rejects them, but she inflects them in new ways. So, for example, the content changes when she moves from American fare to French fare, or at least Americanized French fare. And if you watch the show, the early episodes of the show, she introduces things that now seem very anodyne, but are very surprising at the time. Garlic, she's presenting as something bold and exotic. The artichoke show, she presents artichokes as if we've never seen it before. And this is a period where people have to be schooled in French food. If you watch from the same year as The French Chef, the second James Bond film, From Russia with Love, a key moment in the film, Bond discovers that Donald Grant, played by Robert Shaw, is a Russian agent because when they're on the Orient Express, he orders to go back to Seoul. He orders red wine with Seoul, and immediately Bond knows Russian spy. So one of the things that has to happen, so a move towards French food, a move perhaps towards mediating French food, but a need to instruct in a new kind of cuisine. Most importantly for me, if the cooking show before her is sparse in setting, Julia Child, I think, opens up the set. Literally, it's a bigger set, especially at GBH, and it's this set with a kind of wrap-around table. And she moves from part of the set to another part of the set. So at times she's in the L corner, at times she's in the U. She moves, and means at times the cameramen have trouble keeping up with her. But her motion dynamizes the set. It opens it up. And if you need a proof of that, go to WGBH, where they have in their archives, they have 2 episodes of Joyce Chen's show, Joyce Chen Eats, which was filmed on the same set. They simply changed the decor from French to Chinese, but she doesn't move, and it makes it a completely different show. The most important part of this opening up of the set is Child moves, at the end of the episode, she'll move out of the kitchen into the dining room. And that seems logical, but going back to what I was saying about Dione Lucas, prior to Julia Child, it's not about the cook in the kitchen having pleasure. It's about a kind of martyrdom, sacrifice. You don't need to see the person tasting. You don't need to see the payoff. And I think having a kitchen that you go into is absolutely groundbreaking. I mean, it seems so logical, but it's not, it doesn't. I've found no show before her that has a dining room. Very quickly, if the cooking show is chronological, she changes the chronology. Not dramatically, although by the end of the 60s, she's saying, I just saw this film, Death in Venice. I wish we could do more playing around with temporality like that film. But she does things like open with the finished product. What she does is she shows us a finished Charlotte Malakoff. So she gives us the end at the beginning. The way I put it is she shows us the promised land before the journey starts, so we know where we will go. She shows us the utopia that you will achieve, and I think that's also very important. She clearly overthrows dryness. She's not the dry instructional figure. She is jokey. She adds lore. She gives us background. She gives us personality. And unlike some of the figures like Chef Milani, who are playing with a kind of shtick, you get a sense that her humor, her personality is who she is. It's not put on. It's not a pretense. She is being herself. And I think, again, that makes all the difference. Russ, when I was interviewing him, one thing he said was, one of the reasons you had to still maintain chronology is that once she got going, it was hard to interrupt her. Not simply because she's talking, but because there's a momentum that would be interrupted if you said cut. She would be thrown off. She needs that forceful energy that moves forward, and then that changes the dryness of the cooking show into something else. So that was just to give you some sense of the context before the French chef comes on the scene, and as I call it in the book, the difference she made. So thank you.
Now I know what I was doing. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Schlesinger and the wonderful people and great support that we've had in putting this thing together, and I'm learning so much about what we did 50 years ago. I was just thinking about that, and 50 years ago, here in, not far from here, but it was 50 years ago in '62, I would have probably been in Cambridge, probably at Irving Street with Julia planning the series. And there was parking over there. You know where I'm going with this, right? But context has always been a very important part of my understanding of history, and I hope to impart a little bit of that this afternoon, because it's so different now. It's so different. And in many ways, I don't miss the past, nor did Julia. If there was ever a person who looked towards tomorrow and forgot the past or was uninterested in the past, it was Julia. It was always, what's happening? Where are we going? What are we having for lunch? What are we having for tomorrow's dinner? But not about what we had for breakfast. And that was an endearing trait, and as Dana said, I'll get back to that later. But I thought it might be useful if I told you my version of what I think happened 50 years ago that brought me to Irving Street and her wonderful house with Paul. We were in 1962. We had had a terrible fire, and we managed to burn our studio right down to the ground. And we were blessed because we were given some temporary studio space in perhaps an odd part of town. Or an odd place in town by Boston University. It was a studio where they did the Sunday Mass, the Catholic Television Center. And they said, you could have it during the week as long as you give it back to us for Sunday Mass. And so we would do a series of simple programs there that we could do against a black curtain. One of them was called I've Been Reading, which had been a popular program where book authors would come and sit around, sitting in 2 Harvard chairs and a coffee table. I tell you that just by a little introduction, because the phone rang on a desk that I was sharing with the producer of that program, and it was a woman with I thought it was a woman who wheezed at me that she would require a hot plate when she came to the book show that night. I said, a hot plate? I'm just handling the phone here, lady, but I've never seen a hot plate and I've been reading. It's generally folks sitting around a table and talking to the moderator. But I said I'll be happy to pass that information on, which I did to Muffy Goodhart. And that night, Julia Child arrived with her book to talk about and was given a hot plate, and she gave Al Duhamel the best omelet he'd ever eaten. Now, I didn't see the program. So far as I know, no one at WGBH and with any authority saw the program. You can't see them all. I don't think we taped it. Tape, you got to understand, was a very rare thing. Tape was expensive. We didn't have very many machines. And to see something, you had to see it live for the most part. So I don't think anyone in authority saw Al. But the phones rang. Now, we're not talking here about NBC, okay? We're talking about GBH, educational television. And I know those of you who could thrill to lectures of I.A. Richards. That was the kind of show that we did in those days, and it didn't generate a whole lot of buzz. There was the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Those were big over here in Sanders Theater. And there were some of the other things that we did, but it was a quieter time. We were building the idea. There were only 3 stations in town. We were one of them, and we had a good, powerful signal everywhere except in Cambridge. For some reason, it was the Bermuda Triangle of electromagnetism. Couldn't tune it very well. Someone said from the Cape they couldn't see it down on the Cape. You couldn't see it in Cambridge. And in those days, there was no such thing as cable television. This is rabbit ear country, or at best, Yagi antenna on top of your roof. They didn't work very well because one station's transmitter, ours was over on Great Blue Hill, and the others were out in Needham, perhaps, or up in downtown Boston. So the television antenna didn't know which way to point. Well, you point it towards Jackie Gleason, baby. You don't point it towards I've Been Reading. So we had a little difficulty getting people to watch. Nevertheless, enough of them saw I've Been Reading on Al's show to tickle the interest. And the next thing I heard was, I'd like you to go over and meet with this woman named Julia Child over in Cambridge and see if you can hook together with her a program. The book is a monster book of recipes, and see if you can make any sense out of it. And if you can, let's do 3, we'll budget you for 3 programs. Now, the budget was sort of a joke. You got the use of the crew and a Trailways bus with 17 million miles on it, which had enough equipment so that you could originate programs anywhere, even here. And my forte had been running that bus to various places at MIT and Harvard and so forth. We were the outside studio at a very important time for the station's development in view of the fact that we had no studio. So she and I and Paul and perhaps some others, I can't remember, must have sat down and figured out that we could comfortably do 3 programs sometime, I think, in the late summer, early fall of '62. And the problem was we didn't have a kitchen. So we scurried around and found that the Boston Gas Company had a big auditorium, bigger than this, and in that auditorium they had set up some sort of a kitchen exhibit. I think there were several kitchens displaying the latest kitchen gadgetry that the gas company had participated in developing and was having for sale. And that they were perfectly willing, especially if she was going to use a gas stove, to have Julia and her TV crew come down and use it for a couple of days. And that's where those pilots were shot. My recollection is very poor. I could be way wrong on this, but I just remember the most wonderful time. The bus barely fit next to, this is the old salad or tea building in Park Square. A lot of alleys and trash cans and places to hit. It was very difficult to get the bus there, get it cabled up, get it onto the floor. There was no sink that worked. I remember poor Paul. I always remembered Paul in those days as the pearl diver because he did all the dishes. And he had to work with buckets of lukewarm water to scrub off the pots and so forth. And we didn't really know very much about how to do this. I had come from a background where I was absolutely incompetent when it came to French. I had managed to fail it not only in Lexington High School, but also at Tufts. I was on my way out of the French language. And as far as cooking was concerned, well, I came from a background where my mom was a descendant of Nova Scotian cookery, you know, the famous Nova Scotian cookery. That's a very small book of recipes. So here I am forced to make sense out of a series of techniques and recipes and languages that I don't really understand in a very difficult technical thing, but I had 2 days to shoot 3 programs, and somehow or other we shot them. And it was chaos and it was fun. We, of course, managed to lose those tapes subsequent to their airing. We got them on the air and then we lost them. So they cannot be seen, so far as I know, unless somebody has managed to bring them up. No, nobody's found them? Okay, well, they were missing for 50 years. But we ran them, and again, we got very good response. And very good response in those days might have been 20 letters, not more. That would be a big deal. And so we were able to justify deciding to go forward, and we did with The French Chef. Now, unfortunately, we were out of kitchens again. Again, there's no studio that can take us. We had no budget to rent one. We had to find one. Well, God bless them. The good folks over at Cambridge Gas and Electric, I suppose some of you still pay bills to Cambridge Gas and Electric, but don't demonize them because they couldn't have been more generous. Well, they have this wonderful old building, you know where the three smokestacks are on Western Avenue that front on the Charles River. Well, in there somewhere is a room about this size, and within that larger space on the second floor of a creaky wooden building, which itself is only 2 floors high, I think, is a demonstration kitchen like the one that we used for The French Chef. It had a window out back with curtains. The window didn't look at anything. It was all fake scenery. I think it had an island here with a stove on it. Oh, and given the fact that it was an electric company, I should tell you one quick story. When the bus would hook up, the wires that came in included audio wires, because of course there was no such thing as a wireless microphone. Oh no, you had to have a bigger than that, big cord. And the cord was connected to a mic about that big, and she had to wear it in her budge here. And every time, well, the bus was connected to one side of the electricity, and of course the stove working on the island was connected to another kind of electricity. I'm simplifying. Thus, when she touched any metal part of the stove, she got a little tingle. We traced that for 3 years. And this poor woman, who had never appeared on television before, every time we tortured her with this tingle. It's amazing that she survived it. But what a great lady! What a great lady! She was so much fun, and I can't tell you how much fun it was to work with her. And she was working with barbarians. I remember the crew, a lovely crowd of characters, of mostly young men, a few women, not many, and she would make some amazing thing for the first recipe of the day. And it might be a coq au vin or a boeuf bourguignon or some such. And she would offer it to the crew for lunch. Well, they didn't just turn up their nose, but they did leave. They would much rather take their chances with a submarine sandwich down on Western Avenue someplace than they would ever dream of eating asparagus, let alone caviar, or I remember one notable recipe was that duck, Marion, with the stuffed, the goose, with the stuffed prunes was stuffed with foie gras. That was not going to go down with my crew, I can tell you that. So the sequence of events were that we would come, this was not my only occupation. I was doing important things like the science reporter program with my bus. But on Tuesdays, I remember Tuesdays and Thursdays were French chef days. And we'd start at 8 in the morning. And by the way, there was no overtime. That was the worst thing that could have happened. I could have lost my job if there'd been 1 second of overtime. Nothing like that. So we'd roll at 8. We'd take the unit to the Cambridge Electric Company on Blackstone Street. We'd carry the cameras upstairs. The cameras, by the way, are the size of a small refrigerator. They're very heavy, big fat cables. They never worked very well. And all they would produce is a sort of a grimy black and white picture. We thought they were great, but they weren't as good as the television that's in the surveillance lobby of your homes. So we would do a program in the morning, take lunch, and do another program in the afternoon. 4 a week for, I think we did 13 programs, and then we did another 13. And you know those programs are still running today. And if anyone had ever said they would be doing so, I would have said, you have been drinking something which you should not have been drinking. So now I want to correct a few things. You know, there's been so much written and so forth that I wanted to just show a couple of slides and remind you that not everything that you see or hear about anything take to the bank. Let me see if I can get this going. Good. So I want to show you what it was like in that Cambridge Electric Company kitchen. And I'm going to show you this slide, which is on view downstairs. Now, there is a story here. And Bill Truslow knows this story. I came across this in a publication a year ago, I guess. And it said as a caption, it didn't have this, this Cambridge Gas and Electric Company thing on it. It said, here is the French chef being produced in Cambridge back in the day. And this is the crew it took to do it. Well, no, not exactly. This was a gag. I'm responsible for it. I said, Julia, we're going to do a little fundraising promo here. We're going to take a shot of you from the front, your standard shot in front of your stove. You're going to stand there, and you're going to say, a lot of people ask me whether I'm alone here in the kitchen when I do these programs. And I'm here to tell you that, yes, I am alone. When you say that, Julia, I'm going to take this side shot showing our long-suffering crew or volunteers or observers who happen to be in the studio that day, and you will be casting eggshells, the head of lettuce, a piece of pie, and they'll be conveying it out of the kitchen, and it'll be a very funny moment. We did it, we made it, and I'm sure it was a ha-ha that they ran at WGBH in connection with the promo. But it was a gag. It wasn't real. Part 2. Don't try this at home. Politically incorrect. We would never be able to show this today, of course. There's your Dover sole, right? It's a Dover sole, isn't it? Yeah. And Inside is Alex Peary, the shortest man on the crew. He was our floor manager. And I said, wouldn't it be fun? Again, Julia will start with a head and shoulders, and she'll say, a lot of people ask me, what's the best way to store fish? At that point, she will walk over to the refrigerator, and without batting an eyelash, she will open the refrigerator, Alex will hand her the fish, she'll close the door, and everybody will laugh their brains out. And she will appear nonplussed and continue with, so I hope every time you watch the program, and I hope that's often, that you'll think of putting the fish in the refrigerator when you have to. Folks, it was a gag. That's not what really happened day after day on the show. That's another picture of Alex. Now, the programs were well received by an increasingly large audience. The first time we showed the series, it was only to the Boston audience. But there were other stations that quickly realized that what was working in Boston might work elsewhere, and so the program was subsumed by the educational television stations of the day. It was not called public television, it was educational television. And by the way, there was no real network, okay? It was a mailed network. We mailed tapes around. We hardly had any microwave in those days. There was a little microwave, but there was almost no microwave, no transmission, no way to get these programs out unless you sent tapes around. So I'm giving you a picture here of a technical frontier that we were standing on. And despite that, the program caught on, and the rest is history. So that was the first time that I worked with Julia on The French Chef, and it was a memorable experience. The last time I worked with her was in 1993, 92 or 93, when we shot a program that recalled her days with Paul in Norway. She loved Norway, and she went there she went there at a time when he was still working with the State Department, and they loved it. So as she showed me pictures that Paul had taken of that occasion, and we discussed it, and we found some wonderful people in Norway who thought it would be a great idea for her to come back. We said, well, let's go, and as always, she was up for it. And she would have been in her early 80s, and but full of energy, full of vigor, as we were to find out. And so it was a very aggressive 10-day journey and shooting schedule once we were there. And it's one of my favorite times with her. We had done, part of the show was done in a television studio that did a program like Julia's, but in Norway. She had a chance to try out her Norwegian again, which is an impenetrable language, as you may know. And one of my favorite scenes was the one I'm going to show you. Now, which begins with her going to a fish camp way out in the middle of nowhere, and she is going to be taught how to cast a fly for a Norwegian salmon. Could we have a look at that, please?
The next day we set out at dawn for the Ostrup fishing camp, where I would try my hand at fly fishing, something I hadn't done for years. The farm is owned by the Ostrup family. What good sports they were to let a stranger like me have a go at their prized salmon river. Olof, can anybody come and be a guest here?
No, this place, listener, is private owned.
Oh.
And you have to be invited to come here.
So you have somehow to meet the host so that you can be invited, is that it?
that's right.
Olaf Vendelbo and his family have lived in this valley for generations, where he not only manages the estate, but also tends to the considerable orchards and the potato farm. On the day of our visit, Olaf explained that every bed was taken here at this luxurious private camp. Think of it. Some of Norway's most important people might get to see me catch my fish. Oh, and there are the rods. The estate even has its own tackle room where guests can wander among the old rods and reels and study the ancient fish diaries that chronicle previous victories on the river. A 9-kilo salmon. How many fish have you caught today, Torshov?
Oh, this year has been very few, I'm afraid.
Oh dear. Next, I meet my fishing guide, my gilly, a local man who knows these waters, whose job it is to see that I catch a fish.
Oh, you see, the river is very beautiful today.
Oh, it's lovely, isn't it?
But I'm afraid it's a bit too bright for us.
Well, we'll hope.
Yes, we hope. When it's coming out of the current, it will fish any longer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a question of timing.
Yes.
Yes? Fine. Fine. Nice.
A little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
With Torshild's gentle coaching, I begin to get the hang of casting flies. However, as you can see, my splendid technique is having no effect on the fish. Well, maybe we should try another spot. Perfectly safe because it's on cables.
Yes,
3 cables, yeah.
Very safe.
This one, I've never
But
been
not,
on one like this before.
yeah?
It's wonderful. I would certainly never come out without
So?
you, Torshid.
Oh. I think that's enough. Find a comfortable place to stay.
Okay. All right.
It's okay?
Yep.
You want? There. Fine.
That was
Oh,
good.
that will be interesting to see. What will happen down there now?
Yeah. Obviously, as you can see, the fish don't seem any hungrier here. And just as I was thinking about making my excuses to those I promised a fish to, Torshild called a merciful end to the sporting day.
Good last cast, I'm afraid. Between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the evening, it's not allowed to fish.
Why is that?
It's for protecting the salmon,
Oh.
not to taking up too many of them. But it seems to be no problem just now.
No.
No.
Olaf, I hooked a big salmon that big, but it got away, so I didn't bring you one for dinner. I'm terribly sorry. But what have you
Bad
got
luck.
there? After making my apologies to Olaf, he graciously produced his own wild salmon for us to eat. But not before he prepared it in a way I had never seen before. That's great, and that's just
This
butter
is a
and
sausage.
herbs. Boy,
We
now that
put
looks
this one
like
inside here.
That's a great idea, I think.
We freeze it.
Uh-huh. You always do it this way, Olaf?
Yeah. We do it this way.
Can you do it in the oven if you don't have a grill?
You could do it in oven, but it's difficult with such a big piece of fish.
Just to get it in,
Yeah.
yes. Just have plenty of foil.
Yeah, this is just the beginning.
That's the beginning. Beautiful package.
About the same.
We don't think that this was invented by the people who invented aluminum foil so they could use it up, was it?
It could be.
Well, maybe that'll happen tonight, and we'll see that. pick it up and see how heavy it is. Oh boy. But nothing is not living. That is 6 pounds of salmon and about 24 pounds of paper and aluminum foil.
I think you'll be enough for
That's
about
wonderful.
12 people.
Oh, I see. Then you have the best.
And open the packet.
I can't wait to see it.
I hope it turns out good. I hope it should be ready.
As unlikely as the preparation of this salmon was, I cannot remember a fish that tasted any better. It was beautifully cooked in all that paper and aluminum. I do hope they recycle it.
That's it.
Thank you.
I'll just finish that story and finish my deal here by saying that it was an incredibly long day to do all of this for us, let alone for this wonderful woman that we are all celebrating today. But it wasn't over yet. We got into a pair of helicopters, a chase copter and her copter, and we followed them all up and over the snowy mountains and down the vale and so forth, and we arrived at another place. Now, in Norway, as you remember, in the summertime, it's always daylight at, 11 o'clock. So we got in at 10:30 or 11 o'clock, and it was bright, sunny daylight. We got to the hotel. Marion and I crashed on the bed. Absolutely crashed, dead, gone, forget it. Phone rings. It's Julia. Where are we going to dinner? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have some time for some questions or stories. If you have your own recollections that you'd like to share, we would love to hear them. Well, actually, I would like to ask you a question.
Sure.
If you don't. How did this show change over time? Actually, maybe both of you could speak on that, in both content and how she was with it.
Well, the program changed dramatically once GBH built its studio in 1965. And there was that fateful day. I remember a gathering at GBH in the brand new studios at the time. And they had built her a wonderful set. I was no longer the producer of the show, but they had built her a wonderful set that Dana referred to. And it was right out of the French provincial mode. And we had color cameras just delivered to the studio. And we had a viewing audience like this with monitors, and we tricked the cameras so they were only able to feed black and white to the monitors. And then on a cue, when we cut to the strawberries or whatever it was, we clicked the switch to color, and there was a gasp in the room. And that launched the color sequences, which survived to today.
Fantastic. See, we have a question in the audience.
My name is Jeannie Goddard, and I was a lifelong watcher of Sweet Julia, and I wondered if you could tell us your 3 most memorable shows and why they were the most memorable.
Yeah, sure. The first one, which was Bœuf Bourguignon, because it stands the test of time so well. Marion and I looked at it within the last year or two, and it's as good today as it was 50 years ago. So that has to be one of my favorite ones. This one that I just showed you a clip of is a favorite of mine. And the one that is rarely seen now, which is White House Red Carpet. It was an incredible experience where Julia was invited to the White House to a state dinner, and we were able to work backstage to see how a dinner was put together. And I was able to meet President Johnson twice. The first time I bumped into him, literally, while I was walking backwards leading a cameraman outside of a outside of the florist shop on the ground floor of the White House, and I ran right into a plaid shirt with buttons on it, and I looked up as the PR lady said, "And this is Mr. Morash, Mr. President." And he was so overwhelmed at that experience, he said, "Come on, Uke." Remember the dog that he held up with the ears? "Come on, Uke," and he disappeared. And the next time I saw President Johnson, we were sliding our way down from the West Wing to some other part of the White House, absolutely pitch dark, because he had decided to conserve energy by turning out the light bulbs. So it was pitch dark, and we were moving down across the West Wing passageway, and we bumped right into each other again. But it was a great experience with Julia, and those would be my three most popular.
I'm Natalie Beaumont-Smith. I just had a quick question because it's been referred to about how tall she was, and so you referred to the set that she actually they had built for her. Did they have to raise the counter height? But then the one at the Cambridge Electric Company, obviously that was a standard one that was already made, so it didn't look like she was bending over very much. So were there any accommodations made for her as a person who's taller than the average woman in the kitchen?
Yeah, we did build arrangements to pull the stove up a couple of inches. That was all that was required, but it was definitely necessary to do that. And we had these terrible mirrors, which we used overhead. And you know, that changes everybody's orientation. So you really have to pay attention when you're shooting with a mirror and when you're viewing with a mirror, because left is right and right is left. And it was a very disorienting experience. I do not miss those 2 camera days that Dana talks about, because it was an incredibly difficult thing to do. The cameras, especially over at the Cambridge Gas and Electric, not the studio. The studio cameras are quite different. In fact, you showed a picture of this, someone here showed a picture of the studio. In the studio, you get to have a 500-pound dolly, a proper dolly with elevators in it, so that with a touch of the finger you can raise the camera and lower it. In the field, you have no such. You have to literally crank the camera. It's only meant to be used off the air. You're not supposed to do it on the air. If you do, it'll just be an ugly shot. And there were plenty of ugly shots in those shows, as it were. You saw the stage manager get into both clips that we saw, ours and somebody else's. It happened. The golden days of television, the good old days. See ya.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Zinberg. 2 quick observations on Norway. In real life, my field is science and technology policy, and probably just when you were filming that with Julia, I was the guest of the Secretary of Defense, the Minister of Defense in Norway. And we were being fed salmon 3 times a day, and I would dutifully say, "Thank you, this is absolutely wonderful." And I said that to the Minister of Defense. He said, "Oh, we were fished out years ago. This is all from Canada." So I think the reason that man gave you the fish that he wrapped in aluminum foil was that they had just arrived from Canada. Then the other thing that I wish I could get all the details straight. On the same trip, there were about 4 of us, and we were looking at the guns that the Germans had implanted on the west coast of Norway and how the Norwegians had upgraded them. And a retired admiral was taking us around, and he asked us where we lived, and I told him, and he said, "Do you know Julia Child?" Well, I couldn't believe I'm looking at Nazi guns, listening to a retired admiral ask me if I knew Julia Child. Well, it turns out he was married to her roommate's friend. I mean, all of this Fulbright things and so on. So these worlds had come together in an absolutely great way, and there were no fish.
Well, I want to add a postscript to that. One of the things that we did when we were in Norway with Julia was we visited a Norwegian fish farm and were quite impressed with what they were doing there. It was computer-driven. Very few people were required to produce large quantities of these beautiful salmon and salmon trout, which she visited the farm, but also the factories where they would slice them and fillet them and send them on to various places. So we ate plenty of Norwegian salmon. But on the way to the farm, our captain happened to mention that, oh, and those are the submarine pens where the Nazis used it in World War II. Now, my hobby is World War II, and I would stop everything. Stop everything, we're going to shoot the Nazi submarine pens. So we went in and shot the Nazi submarine pens until they were level. I mean, for an hour and a half, we shot every possible thing you could shoot inside this rather remarkable installation on one of the fjords near Bergen, I believe. And then we went on to the fish farm. Phone rings in the boat that we were taken out by. So the Norwegian secret police or something, and they said, somebody has been shooting in the submarine pen. And we want the footage, and we want to interrogate the people and so forth. We got ourselves into an international incident, thanks to my history love affair with the romance of that terrible time.
I wanted to before we go on to the next question, I wanted to jump back to the question about favorite episodes, and especially if there's anyone from GBH here, I wanted to make a plea for more episodes to go onto DVD. And the one I would love to see become more available is one that Laura also worked on, which is called Ham Dinner in 30 Minutes. I don't know if that was one you directed, but it's interesting because it's an episode, it's at the GBH archives. I hope everybody doesn't go there tomorrow and say, let me see that episode, where Paul Child appears on camera. And it's a great episode because it's a good example of the last minute guest. The first shot is Paul on the phone saying, Julia, I'm bringing some guests over. Could you make something? Could you make, for example, that ham dinner? And then we cut to Julia sitting in the kitchen, hanging up the phone and saying, little does he know, I have cards that explain dinners and I can make ham dinner in 30 minutes. And then she actually sets the alarm for 30 minutes, and it's a race against the clock, and it's a wonderful episode, but you also get to see Paul on camera. So I'd love for that one to become available, and it's not currently.
That's great. Yes.
Hi, I'm Maura Clark, and I am curious about one of the biggest mishaps or most memorable mishaps that was on the show, and how she responded to it and how you and your crew responded to it.
Oh, you want the whole list, or?
Oh, yeah. As long as you are willing.
There were a couple that I recall. The Cambridge Gas and Electric Company, this old creaky warehouse that we did, we're on the second floor, so it was a freight elevator with a bad bell, a big noisy bell. And I remember once in the middle of a take, now this is not going to impress anybody unless you realize that we could not stop. It was, think of it as a live television program. We did not edit anything. Was not permitted. It sounds impossible today, but when we did cut tape, we cut it with a razor blade and Scotch tape, and the tape was that wide. So we did not cut tape, which was nothing we could do about it. In the middle of this demonstration that Julia is bravely going forward with, I have no idea what the show title is, the bell for the freight elevator goes off. Without a pause, she says, must be the plumber. It's about time he showed up. That was one. That happened. We didn't think of it as it was a good save. It was a good save. You're alone in the kitchen. Pick it up and go on with your life. It was a fairly dramatic one. We were this was the potato pancake that fell on the what happened? Yeah. And then there was an occasion out when we were shooting dinner at Julia's with one of the guest chefs, and she was doing something with her amazing blowtorch, and some flaming crepe or something went out of the frying pan and right onto the floor and caused a big scorch and so forth. But, you know, life goes on. It's like a continuation. It's not, nobody remembers it 10 minutes after it happened.
I remember being in Denver. Have the mic.
Come up here.
Here, why don't... Go ahead, go ahead.
My name, excuse me, I'm going to try and do this with laryngitis. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Pebble Gifford, and one of my connections with Julia, well, I lived in Cambridge, but a very important connection to both of us is we went to Smith, and obviously in different eras, but she loved Smith and was a very faithful alumni, and and she was very nice to me because of that connection over the years, and helped me in my business, which wasn't food. But I was also fortunate to go on location with the Morashes and Julia a couple of times, and a very memorable one was Yosemite National Park, and she was doing a performance there, and you were taping, weren't you, Russell? There, were you taping that? Yosemite.
Wrong, Pebble. No, you weren't there with Julia. It was Marion who was cooking in Yosemite. You and Marion were cooking.
Oh, I got that one mixed up. Okay, well, it was another one I was with her on, sorry. But last but not least, you never rehearsed shows because you couldn't drop the chicken twice, and there was no text. So how did you and she work together to pull off what she'd say and when? Thank you.
It was difficult, but you would ask her to go through a rundown that was written. She would write everything down, and the position of all the mise en place would be worked out, so you weren't surprised. The contrast is one of a show that you may have forgotten called The Frugal Gourmet. He never knew where anything was, so half the show he spent looking for something. It must be down in here somewhere. But Julia always knew where everything was. And if we couldn't supply her with enough acreage for the stuff she needed, we would send in a band of loyal volunteers and lovely, often ladies, some men, but often ladies, friends and family and so forth, and we would send them in, we'd call them magic fingers, would come in off camera, always off camera, to give some relief to the trays that were building up and so forth, but no conveyor belt, like a human conveyor belt like you saw in the picture.
Okay, I think that is the end of our session today.